Hey guys, so this is I guess the last video in a little 3-part series or whatever on basal ganglia. So the last thing I want to talk about is dopamine and different pathologies involved, right? So we'll talk about Parkinson's, Huntington's, all that good stuff. So first thing, this is my really ugly midbrain in the corner over here, and we're going to release dopamine from my substantia nigra pars compacta, and I'm making dopamine blue just to kind of separate it from glutamate and GABA. So something to note is that dopamine is excitatory, and it's kind of a weird concept, but dopamine stimulates both D1 and D2 receptors. So I don't think that's like properly described in lecture. So dopamine stimulates both D1R and D2R. So these do different things, right? So we know D1R, this is going to activate my direct pathway. D2R inhibits indirect pathway. So what does this mean? This means that on both ends we are facilitating movement, right? So D1 is going to cause stimulatory, so it's not GABA. I don't want to use green for GABA, but just I want you to keep in mind that this is stimulatory. So I don't know, let's use like a different kind of green, right? So D1 is going to be stimulating the striatum on the direct side, and then we're going to have a different kind of red, right? So D2 is going to be inhibiting the indirect pathway. So keep in mind, like these are just like our regular neurons that like are involved in this pathway, and they happen to have a D2 receptor, right? So this neuron is inhibiting indirect pathway. So because I kind of drew it out like this, it might make things a little bit easier. So since we have direct pathway stimulated, we know that we're going to release a ton of GABA here, right? So we know striatum always releases GABA. So we have D1 stimulated, direct pathway on, so ton of GABA released. That means that my globus pallidus interna releases barely any, which means that my thalamus can release a ton of glutamate, stimulate cortex. Cortex can go ahead, stimulate spinal cord, right? Ooh, okay, cool. So now let's talk about indirect pathway. So now this guy was inhibited, right? So we kind of have like our faded little red line here. So because we're inhibited there, that means that I'm not going to release much GABA this way, which means that my GPE is going to release a ton of GABA on my subthalamus, because like I said before, globus pallidus always releases GABA because subthalamus is inhibited. We only put a teeny tiny bit of glutamate out, which means that this, obviously, my GABA here is has a much stronger influence than this little tiny bit of glutamate, which means my globus pallidus interna is not releasing too much GABA onto my thalamus. So I hope that these weighted lines kind of describe the situation a little bit more. As you all know, I'm a little bit messy, but hopefully my verbal description was able to kind of have you follow this. So this isn't a normal person. So we know that in Parkinson's, you lose your dopamine, right? So we lose dopamine. And because we lose dopamine, we go ahead and lose this ability of what's written over here, right? So now we lose activation of my direct pathway, and we lose inhibition of indirect, and what that causes is an excess of indirect pathway. So this means that what do I want to give? I want to give a D2 agonist can help with Parkinson's, right? So if I give a D2 agonist, I'm sorry, so we would give a D2 receptor agonist, because D2 receptor agonist is going to go ahead and inhibit the inhibitory pathway. I just want to make sure that I'm speaking clearly, so that's why I took a little pause there. So now let's talk about in Huntington. So I got a question regarding, or not a question, a ton of questions. Why would you give a D2 antagonist for Huntington's? It makes no sense, right? So if we hop over to our essential notes and we look at treatment, so I just want to prove where I'm getting all this from. We give antagonists of D2R. Why would we do this? So it's, drugs disinhibit surviving D2R expressing neurons, and you're just like, wait a second, why would we do that? We lost our, you know, we know that Huntington's, we lose our D2 receptor expressing neurons. This is why, right? Because if I give a D2 antagonist, we know that in Huntington's we have too much movement, right? So a D2 antagonist, do I want to keep all of this? Let's clear this up a little bit, right? So we'll make it a little less busy. So in Huntington's, we're losing part of our striatum. And in Huntington's, I have too much movement. So because of that, if I block my D2 receptor, that means that I'm going to give just a tiny bit of blocking on my inhibitory pathway, so not much, right? Which means my inhibitory pathway will then turn on. So because my inhibitory pathway turns on, so D2R, let me write this out in words, antagonist for Huntington's, yes, because we want to disinhibit indirect pathway, aka turn indirect on equals less movement. I don't think I could put that in any shorter words. You guys know me, I like it short and simple. Then again, we'll run through this one more time. So because we are putting a D2R blocker, so we get our this little orange line, I guess, would be our D2 receptor blocker, would make GABA super low. So this line is actually like too thick, right? Because since we're blocking it, we would make it something like this. So D2 receptor has barely any effect on the striatum, can't block it, which means that indirect on GPE releases that. We know that GPE releases GABA, disinhibit, or I'm sorry, what am I doing? This line is super thin because we blocked GABA release. This stimulates GPI. GPI releases a ton of GABA on the thalamus. Then no movement, right? So teeny tiny bit. So I hope this cleared things up with the D2 antagonist. I know maybe it was a little bit lengthy, a little bit wordy, but I think these like little notes to keep in mind are a little bit helpful, right? So just this right here, dopamine is stimulatory, D1 receptor activates direct, D2 receptor inhibits indirect pathway. So there's this like one extra step that like not a lot of people, you know, talk about, which makes things get a little bit messy. So that's why for Parkinson's, we give a D2 receptor agonist because we want to inhibit the indirect pathway. So I hope this cleared things up. Last pathology I'll just mention is anything that has to do with hemibolismus, you're thinking subthalamus. So just be able to point it out on an image, right? So we said our subthalamus was here. Keep that in mind. Okay guys, I'm going to make a cerebellum video soon. I hope this cleared things up. If there's anything in specific that you want a video for, just let me know and I'll try to do my best. Thanks guys.